This video is brought to you by Patreon provider Lin.
Hello and welcome back to your viewer. You can clearly see that I'm still doing a bunch of filming before Christmas. As a result, I'm just trying to stay in the festive spirit. This optic is an Amazon special, graciously sent in by a Patreon provider Lin. Lin, thank you very much. Lin actually helped DiscoveryOptic, or DiscoveryOptic, set this optic up. And they wanted me to check it out to see how I like it. This is a $360 Chinese-made 3-15 first focal plane MPVO. So, without further ado, let's get this box cracked open and see what we've got. There isn't a whole lot of information to the box, and that's fine. But so far, it seems to be pretty robust as far as the cardboard goes. I'm a big fan of nice boxes, as you know. Unfortunately, when you're paying as little as $360 for first focal plane optic of any sort, it kind of makes me leery about where they put their money. Like I already said, this is a $360 optic, so I'm not expecting the world out of it. However, you might be looking for something for an airsoft gun, a really cheap plinker, just something that you want to throw on there and just shoot around and play around with, and it doesn't really matter. Well, if you're looking for something as far as bang for the buck, this might be an option for you. Primarily because not only do you get an optic, but you also get your choice of height rings. This one included, I believe, the 30 millimeter is the tube size. I believe these are high or extra high rings. On top of the rings and the scope, you also get a leveling kit, which is pretty slick. You get a sunshade, and then you get the optic, as well as a little cleaning brush. Look at that. So cool. The box does smell a lot like chemicals, so I'm not the biggest fan of that. Now, because this is a full-on kit, I might as well go over everything. Starting with the rings. They seem okay. Kind of loose tolerance, as you can see on the cap versus the body itself. And you do get 2 cross bolts to lock the claw in, and one little very small, kind of sloppily machined block to interfere with your pick rail. It's a ring. As far as the leveling tool, is very similar to the leveling tool that I had bought and reviewed a while ago, and it works the exact same way. This goes on your Picatinny rail, like so. A little hard to see, I apologize. And then you take the small wedge, or the large wedge, depending on your ring height, to level up the bottom of the optic here with your pick rail. They do work fairly well, or at least the one that I had reviewed works fairly well, so I have no doubt that this would work well as well. Multiple wells in that sentence. So for the price of $360, you do get a lot of quantity, but do you get quality? Taking a look at the scope, you can see we have a scope cap on the front. It's a regular, very inexpensive type, kind of similar with what you find on the lesser expensive Primary Arms products, but on the rear you get this little butt plug. That's sort of just like clips on there. It's actually pretty solid, but the problem is you pull this off, you put it on the bench, it blows away, you shoot it off, you put it in your pocket, flies out, and now you only have a single scope cap on the front. Kind of interesting sort of take on why you would do that, but wonders will never cease. Starting at the back, we have a fast focus eyepiece, which actually doesn't feel half bad. Very fine threads. Comes all the way out. You can see a little bit of oil on there. Quarter turn in. And you know what? Side to side is very tight. And so is up and down. There's actually no wiggle to this. And as you can hear it, it's very smooth and quiet. As you can see on the back, the knurling on this thing is very aggressive. Probably way more aggressive than what they need. They probably don't even need this thing to have any knurling whatsoever. But it's nice to know that it's there and you can get good traction on it. And again, this thing feels pretty good. But again, this is right out of the box. Run this thing for a couple months, a couple of years, put a couple hundred rounds through it, or drop it once or twice and see how well it holds up. On to the magnification ring. We go from 3 to 15, and it's just past 180 degrees, as you can see, which is perfectly fine. We see very similar of the knurling, but look at this. Aggressive knurling, not so aggressive knurling. Slightly different aggressive knurling. This is definitely a different material because you can see the anodizing didn't take as well. So I wonder if this is just a softer, cheaper piece of aluminum that they couldn't get as sharp as all the other components, but still the same style, same. So why would they make this lesser when this is the one that you're probably going to be using the most? Again, wonders will never cease. Anyway, going from its minimum to its maximum actually requires a fair bit of force. Doesn't feel bad. There's no hard spots, there's no soft spots. And you can hear the seal inside rubbing, which is good. That means it's doing its job. Should be weather sealed. And that's it. It's actually not terrible. But I wish that they had this aggressive knurling over here, considering this is going to be what you're going to adjust more frequently. On to the illumination control. You can see we go from 1 to 6 with offs in between. And thanks to that knurling, we have a pretty decent purchase on this thing to adjust it. And you know what? There's a little bit of play inside the detent, but it pops out and pops back in quite authoritative. It's actually pretty nice. Again, you get a little bit of wiggle, but you know you're turning it and it's going to stay there. Not bad at all. Now, I usually harp on other manufacturers for making the battery compartment too easy to access. DiscoveryOptic probably watched my videos and said, we want to do the exact opposite. We want to make it almost impossible to get into there. So, as you can see, the battery compartment has no way of really grabbing it. It's just a smooth disc. There's no coin slot. There's no texture on the outside. So I'm going to try to get this. I'll use my shirt. That do it? Yep. That just did it. There we go. Kudos on them for making it not so easy to pull out. You see your standard, oh, I gotta get in frame. You see your standard sort of battery cap, big O-ring in the corner, and those nice little leaf springs. I bet you're going to see 3 dimples underneath this thing. And we do. These battery compartments work fine. They're on all the lesser expensive stuff, all the way up to about $1,000. I've seen some optics that use this exact same internal setup. So, probably more than sufficient. From there, we're going to check out the side focus, and you can see we have an L8H15. I think that's going to relate itself back to the magnification ring. I could be mistaken. Either which way, our next number up from there is 20. So 20 yards or 20 meters is still pretty damn close. So again, if you're going to be putting this on an airsoft gun or a rimfire, this would do a lot of work for you, because if you're shooting inside that distance, you'll have no problem focusing down that low, as long as the glass is good enough to allow you to actually see your target. Goes all the way up to infinity, and we have 270 degrees of rotation from minimum to maximum. Again, the knurling on this is very nice, and this is very well damped. This requires a good amount of effort to turn it. Almost, honestly, on par with the Gen 3 Razor 6-36. It's actually quite nice. Absolutely silent, with no soft or hard spots. Kudos. Kudos, DO. Kudos. That's very nice. From there, we're going to check out the elevation turret. As you can clearly see, lock equals down. So unlock must equal up. Pretty simple. We only have a little hash mark at the bottom. We do not have one that separates in between the cap and the body, but that's fine. And one thing to note, this is in 1/8 MOA increments per click. So 8 clicks per MOA is super, super precise. Typically, a quarter MOA will be 0.25 of an inch at 100 yards. This will be 0.125 of an inch at 100 yards. And 0.1 of a mil is usually like 3/8 of an inch. So this technically should be way more precise at making micro adjustments for your zero or for dialing at distance. However, just because this should be more precise doesn't mean that it's going to be. And I still don't have an MOA target that's up to my standards, but we should still be able to see if this thing tracks fairly well or fairly consistent between mils. Anyway, you can see there's a fair bit of play. But a decent sound. Feel is lacking. But it does line up fairly well. And it's easy to lock and unlock. Not too easy to unlock like the Tractoric. No, it's not that easy. It's actually better than that. But it sounds good, and it feels okay. I mean, it lines up well enough, and that's good enough for me. I really wonder if Lin was pushing towards DO my sort of sensibilities with optics, because this thing does have a Christmas tree-ish reticle, a locking elevation turret, and a capped windage turret. Because, again, with most Christmas tree reticles, you don't really need to adjust it all that much. So having a capped or at least a locking windage is kind of intelligent for me. Unfortunately, though, the windage turret is not as well set up as the elevation. We have 0, 1, and 7. So you have 8 full rotations per turn, and this is going to be a set it and forget it sort of ordeal, which again, I understand based on the reticle style and what this thing might be used for. You're not going to really dial for windage, you're just going to hold for it. It makes sense. But regardless, I still like to see 0, 1, 0, 1 with an R and an L. But it is what it is. Very similar sound. Actually a better feel. But a fair amount to play inside the detents. But once you pull out that slack, it sounds and feels pretty damn good, actually. So there you have it, folks. A $360 optic that comes with a leveling kit and a set of rings. But like I had already asked, is this any good? It's time to find out.
Let's get right into it, ladies and gentlemen. The reticle on this is simply called the SFIR First Focal Plane Reticle, or at least I think so. There's no real dedicated information for it. It's a very simple tree reticle with a fairly decent illuminated center, as you'll soon see. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are very nice and welcome to see, though I would prefer if they were a little bit thicker to help draw my eye towards the center a little bit faster. One thing you will take note of is just how little of the scope body you see, yet how large the view is through this thing. It's honestly painfully impressive, like Razer HD Gen 2 3 to 18 levels of impressiveness. But I'd be hard-pressed to say that this is a direct competitor against the Gen 2 Razer HD, even though I will compare it later on in this video. Before we talk about the illumination, let's quickly talk about the reticle, because they definitely took some design cues from Meopta and from March. And truth be told, I actually quite like it. The illumination is also very well done. Even though this is an MPVO, it's a little bit brighter than what you typically find on most other optics of this magnification range. So, well done, DO. Just when you thought we were done, we are not. I have a couple things I have to show you still. Taking it from 12 to 15x or so, you'll note that the reticle shifts left to right ever so slightly. This is something that you won't really notice when you're behind it because your head's going to be moving no matter what. But on a rigid setup like I have here, you notice it. One thing you would notice, however, is the sharpness to the reticle. So I adjusted the rear eyepiece to make the center of the reticle look really sharp, and it looks fantastic. Unfortunately, the rest of the reticle looks kind of soft, so I adjusted to make the rest of the reticle look pretty good. And it does come out pretty good, at the cost of making the center of the reticle extremely soft. There is a middle ground, though, that you can find where most of the reticle looks to be really good, but unfortunately never gets as sharp as it should throughout the entire view of the reticle, at least here at the higher magnification ranges. This is backed out to about 12x so you could see the whole entire reticle, and honestly it doesn't get much better the higher up you go. Fortunately, below 10x you don't really notice it. But there is another thing we must talk about, and that is the off-axis view through this thing and just what it does to the reticle and the image. Here again at about 10 to 12x, the reticle just falls completely apart the second you go slightly off-axis with it. Bring it up to its maximum of 15, guess what? It's only even more noticeable. To a lot of people, this won't make that much of a difference, but if you're shooting in a slightly less than perfect sort of position, you are going to notice it. If you don't have a perfect cheek weld, let's say you have this on top of a 1022 with a standard stock with a really shitty comb and no cheek weld, you're going to notice it. At 8x here, it's still very noticeable, though fortunately the exit pupil is a little bit larger than what we saw earlier at the higher magnifications. And at 3x you don't really notice it, mainly because the exit pupil is so large you have a lot of view through this thing side to side. Unfortunately, you're going to notice it, especially if you have a really bad cheek weld or if you're in an off position. But let's focus our attention on something a little more dynamic, namely our 400-yard brick building. Now, I know I'm getting ahead of myself with my typical sort of layout for my reviews, but bear with me, this is going to be important for the rest of the video. So, before we go any further, let's freeze frame it real quick and look at something. And the main thing we're going to be focusing on is distortion real quick. The rooftop right in front of us is about 50 yards out, and I drew a nice little red line that's straight across it from end to end. Notice that bow in the middle. That is definitely something that you pick up behind this thing. It's a little bit harder to pick up on video, but if we can analyze a photo like this, it's something that is very apparent to see. So, throughout the rest of this video, take note of that as well, because it is there. But let's get back to the matter at hand, the distortion with the reticle. So, at 3x going side to side, honestly, you don't really notice any sort of degradation to the reticle or the image. Honestly, it's a pretty good performance. So, at 3x, you know that you're safe, which is good, with the exception of that massive amount of fisheye. Bringing the magnification back up to around 8x, we're going to see how well it performs again. The reticle looks still pretty sharp, but once we go slightly off axis, it falls apart rather quickly. The image behind it doesn't seem too bad, but the shadows do seem to creep up very quickly. So, you might have a decent view of your target, but the reticle is just going to start falling apart the second you go slightly off axis. The shadows creep up really quick, so maybe you could take that as, hey, I know exactly where the center is going to be. For me personally, I'd love to not see that, but unfortunately, it's built to a very low price point, and that's something that you just can't escape from. At 12x, it does the exact same thing you're going to think it's going to do, which is fall apart even faster. And it's just really disheartening. When you're behind this thing and trying to get situated, you could have the perfect cheek weld, but let's say you get a little fatigued in your neck, and that does happen from time to time. Even with a good cheek weld in a good position, it just falls apart, and it's not enjoyable. At 15x, I adjust the side focus to see if we can get a little more clarity out of the image, but honestly, the image itself, that brick building, looks really, really good. But the reticle just doesn't, and it falls apart almost immediately the second you go slightly off axis. I have reviewed many optics, and unfortunately, this is one of the worst performances I've seen. Again, though, it's built to a very low price point. There's more to it than just that, but we'll touch on that more towards the end. But let's see if I adjust the rear eyepiece, if we can make the reticle look a little better and maybe perform a little bit better once we're in the shadows. I get it to where it's basically perfect on the center, and we'll shift it side to side, and nope, it does the exact same thing. And as if that wasn't bad enough, ladies and gentlemen, let's freeze frame it one more time and take notice of the fisheye that we still have here at 15x. Typically on most magnified optics, you'll have really bad problems at the low end or the top end. In this case, this had really bad fisheye at 3x, which would usually go away the second you start increasing the magnification. But here at 15x, we still have the exact same sort of distortion and fisheye, which, yes, is very noticeable when you get behind it and start going slightly off axis. It culminates into a concoction of, well, how should I say, not goodness. Now, I'm sure for many of you, you've already stopped the video and said, this scope isn't good enough for my money, and I'd completely respect and understand where you're coming from. But for the rest of you that want to watch this, let's get into the rest of it, shall we? The turrets aren't terrible. I just don't know why they chose to go 1/8 MOA as opposed to 1/4 MOA or 1/10 mil. Something standard. 1/8 MOA is typically set for really far, like F-class shooting scopes, not this. So because this is not only MOA but 1/8 MOA and my target is still only in mils, I know I haven't set up an MOA yet and I'm sorry, but I'm not going to bore you with the entire thing. Just know that when you are dialing up, when you go about 10 mils, which is about 36 MOA, guess what? It tracks perfectly fine. It doesn't go off axis on the windage. It's fine. And it does return to 0, which is nice to see. When we play around with the windage, when we're going to the right, I believe it is, it's okay. It follows along the line. It doesn't go up or down. It's okay. However, when we return back to 0 and go to the left, that is when you'll see that it ramps up and it changes the elevation as we're changing the windage, which is no bueno. So tracking wise, it's just okay. Because we already went through this section earlier, I'm not going to spend too much time here. We're just going to touch on a couple of key points. First things first, there is very little scope body showing, and when you get behind it, it literally fades away. It's very impressive. Unfortunately, I wish the rest of the performance of this glass was as impressive as that is, because it truly is something special. Also, the view through this thing is incredible, and I'll showcase that in just a second. Illumination here on full is more than acceptable for what it is. Going to my standard 2x crop, you'll see that the image of this thing is fucking gigantic. It really does rival the Razer Gen 2 HD, which you will see very soon. This thing is capable of producing very clear images, but having something be very clear and very good are two totally different things. As we've seen already, despite the fact the image might be sharp, it might be bright, and it might have pretty decent color representation, however, that distortion is something that is very real and that you can't escape. I'm skipping over the 400-yard brick building because we already spent a lot of time there, so we're going to now focus our attention to our 800-yard power tower and those 30-yard power lines. Now, there is a lot of mirage in the air because when I filmed this, again, it was very cold outside and very warm in my apartment, so there's going to be a lot of mirage. The side focus makes light work of going between 800 yards and 30 yards fairly easy, with giving good, accurate results as far as where the focus is. I didn't feel like I had to hunt to get everything nice and sharp when I was behind it, so that is at least a plus. And here at 800 yards, I think the image is pretty good. Again, for this price point, there's not a whole lot we can totally expect. Given the fact that the mirage is as prevalent as it is, I think that it can't get much better than this, to be brutally honest. And despite the price and the mirage, this still qualifies to take a look at 1,000 yards. And here with 0 mils of added elevation, or 0 MOA in this case, it honestly produces quite a damn good image. The mirage settled down a little bit, but again, clear and sharp don't necessarily go hand in hand with good. But no one shoots with 0 added elevation, so I add about 36 MOA and then center up the scope again. And you know what? The image is still pretty decent. Mirage kicks up a little bit, but it's not that much far off than what it was. It's still not what I'd consider great, but given the price and how this thing is performing otherwise, it's not terrible. Take a quick note about how the horizon looks to the far left of the image. Nice and orangey hue. When you look through the scope, it's gray and muddled and messy. So during the daylight hours, the color representation isn't bad, but in darker environments, it's not great. Illumination on full is actually too bright for a curtain environment, so I step it down a couple of notches. In fact, when we go all the way down to its lowest, it's actually still very bright. Brighter than what I'd say most other magnified illuminated optics are. So if you want to use this thing in really dark environments, it still might actually be too bright, which is actually kind of interesting. But slowly increasing the magnification to its maximum here at 400 yards, I can say that the image still looks pretty bright. It doesn't really get that much darker at any sort of magnification range, or at least to my eye. And illumination here is still way too bright, but you could see it doesn't look really sharp or great. It's really harsh coming in from one side, and it has like almost a shadowy effect on half the reticle. So it's not the best performance by a long shot. But this thing lets in more light than I was expecting. We already know that this thing is capable of producing pretty good images at 30 yards to 400 yards, even to 1,000 yards. So here at 50 yards, it should still be capable of producing a fairly good image. And truth be told, once I dial in the side focus here at its maximum of 15x, lo and behold, it actually does produce a fairly good looking image. As long as you're stationary with a perfect cheek weld and you have good light, you have nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, those are not necessarily always things that you're going to have. The only real negative I can say to the image here at hand is that little bit of chromatic aberration at the top part of the target. But honestly, this thing doesn't really suffer from chromatic aberration like many other optics that we've seen. As far as focusing on the target itself, this glass produces fairly good sharp images like I had mentioned earlier. You can make out all the words on top with the exception of the really small fine print, but if you're using this thing for just target shooting or plinking around, it's more than sufficient. Now let's again talk about something that we've already gone over, and it's going to be the eyebox. Before, just shifting it side to side is a good representation of showing you just how twisted this thing can get, but really dancing the camera behind this optic will go to show that it can get nauseating when you're not behind it just right. The 3x is honestly pretty good, so I bump it up to 10x pretty quickly. At this magnification, you can really pick up the reticle and just see how out of focus it gets the second that you're not behind it perfectly right. It's something that you cannot escape from this thing, and you will notice immediately. It's even further reinforced when we go higher up in the magnification range here to 15. The second you go slightly off of it, it just falls apart. However, you can produce good-looking images with really little scope body that makes for an overall fairly decent experience, as long as you have a perfect cheek weld or you don't care about the finer things in life. On to some comparisons, and as you can very clearly see, our first competitor is going to be the Swampfox Kentucky Longitude 12. It's not the same magnification range, but it's also actually rather not the same price range, considering it's about $500, and this thing is again in the mid 300s, so there's a large price discrepancy. The Swampfox is, however, a very good optic that's basically warranted by its price point. But if there's one thing that the DiscoveryOptic does way better than the Swampfox, well, if it's not plain to see, ladies and gentlemen, I guess I'll spell it out for you. The view through it is fucking gigantic. These are both cropped identically. Just take a look at how much less of the scope body you see looking through the DO versus the Swampfox. It's legitimately almost twice the size when you're getting behind these two. It really is something that you must behold. However, like I said, just because it's good in one regard doesn't make it good in all regards. Next up is going to be probably the most realistic competitor, and that's going to be the Arken SH4 Gen 2 4-16. These two are right around the same price point, believe it or not. The Arkens went on sale, if I remember correctly, around Christmas time 2022, and they were very inexpensive. I think they even went down below $300, which is stupid cheap for how good they are. They're not great, but they honestly perform really well for their price point. In fact, excellently well for their price point. And honestly, it's, like I said, the best competitor to this DO that we have. Last up is going to be the Gen 2 Razor HD 3-18. I wasn't lying when I said the DO had a giant view looking through it, one that would rival it. In fact, it's got a larger view looking through it as opposed to the Gen 2 Razor HD. But unfortunately for the DO, the Gen 2 absolutely just defecates all over this thing. But keep in mind, the Gen 2 is still a $1,600+ optic, whereas this thing's only $365. But I can sit here and objectively compare this DO against these three other optics 100% in every way, shape, and form. But to do so would miss out on the entire purpose of that optic as a whole. You see, there's something that you might not realize. In other parts of the world outside the US and some other first world nations, you can't really buy or import quote-unquote military-grade equipment, and that includes optics. So for some countries out in the Pacific Rim, like China, they can't buy or import Vortex products, let's say. I'm not too sure of the exact list of what they can and cannot buy, but if it's quantifiably quote-unquote military, they can't get it, even though some of these products are made there. So this company, DiscoveryOptic, wanted to build this optic to be sold in some of those countries for as cheap as possible, while still being as good as possible. And this is a first attempt for them. So, looking at this scope now subjectively, and realizing all of that now comes together a little bit differently with how well it performs. You see, externally, it's fine. It feels pretty good. The controls are acceptable for its price point. And honestly, looking through it, that first initial, holy shit, the view through it is massive. It really hits you hard. And it's something that can be appreciated. Sure, it has its shortcomings. Sure, the reticle might just dissolve away into nothingness and the image might completely fall apart if you're slightly off center of it at any magnification above 8x. But still, that would be missing the point. The point is, this is a first attempt at producing an optic to the best of their abilities that they can sell for people that are going to use it for airsoft guns. Because I don't even know if you're allowed to own firearms in many of these countries where this optic is going to be sold. So in that regard, this is actually pretty freaking good. Would I really recommend this to anyone in the US? Honestly, probably not. There are other avenues you can go. There are other manufacturers you can purchase from. But guess what? If you like what you're seeing here, you're okay with the price, or you're willing to give it a shot, then go for it. I've laid out everything for you, all of its negatives and all of its positives. Truth be told, the second you get behind one, if you just admire it for how girthy the image is, you're going to be completely blown away. And you might be okay with the fact that it might fall apart off axis. And you know what? That's great. Good for you. That means you're going to be happy with your product. However, if I were to change a couple things on this, I would absolutely do away with the 1/8 MOA increments. I think they should just be thrown away and left for F-class shooters. Truth be told, DO, if you're watching this, why even bother with something so fine? If this is being sold in most other countries outside the U.S., well, yes, it's being sold in the U.S., but it's targeted for countries outside the U.S., why not just do it in the metric system like the rest of the world? 1/10 mil increments are perfect for like every single shooter except for people that don't understand how mils work. And they work the exact same way as MOAs, but even easier, believe it or not. I really need to thank DO as well as Patreon provider Lin for bringing this optic to my attention. I probably never would have discovered it otherwise. DiscoveryOptics, get it? That's fun, it's a play on words. But it's the truth. And truth be told, I think this is a great beginning to a company's start. They actually just sent me the 5-25, which I've had the privilege of using for the last couple of weeks now, and I have to say it's a little bit of a step in the right direction, though it could still use a little bit of refining. However, it's still so cheap that it makes you wonder how it could even be as good as it is for the price. There are, however, other options, at least here in the US. So if you're here in the US and you say, oh, I'd rather have this, that, or that, great. A lot of other countries don't have that option. So if you're in one of those countries that doesn't have that option, I think this is a halfway decent option for you, considering if it's the only thing you got, it's better than nothing. Anyway, with all that being said, a huge thank you to Lin and DiscoveryOptics for sending this in. I say keep on going. I think you have a good future, and if you continue taking constructive criticism correctly, you can produce something great. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and as always, see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.